Um, okay. My name's Liam Gillick, and I am the common thread in my work. For me and for certain other people of my generation, is the attention hasn't really been on the physical quality of the work. The physical manifestation of an idea has been viewed as the least significant, or the area that requires the least amount of examination. What happened, in fact, because of that, is you get, by this point, a kind of real split, where you see that there's an almost parodic kind of allegorical sort of super subjective realism on one hand, and then you've got a kind of, which is over-analyzed and over-valued by the people who support it, and on the other hand you have various forms of critical consciousness, you could say, which possess or use or deploy certain forms of abstraction, yet those forms of abstraction are often under-examined. So you have one side where things are over, an excessive meaning or significance is put into something, and the other side where there's a kind of been a limit. The thing that means for someone like me is, for nearly 20 years, it's been possible to sort of evade scrutiny on a certain level. You see what I mean? That the focus has not been on certain abstract manifestations of work, but more on what is behind it, because that's been the drive to understand, the drive to educate, the drive to decode art. When you think about abstraction, you have to think about it in at least two ways, and these things have to exist in your head at the same time. One is what you could call the semiotics of the built world, where you encounter, even if you're just in the middle of the countryside and there's one road, one long line leading into the distance, you're dealing with some form that has been deployed by a human being that changes something, that has this kind of clarity about it. And that, of course, leads to certain forms of art and certain forms of abstraction within art. You have to keep this in your mind. This idea of the semiotics of the built world and how that can be clarified, decoded, more democratic, how it can be not just nationalistic, all these kind of old hopes for abstraction, that they could speak beyond language, that they could communicate beyond class, that they could, you know. On the other hand, we also have what I think of as the abstraction of development and neoliberalism and globalization, which creates ongoing abstractions all the time. People think it doesn't, but in fact it creates kind of structural abstraction that is divorced from the reality of what it is. It's abstracted from the actual reality of certain exchanges. And it means that people thought, I think, that you could deconstruct and use postmodern tools to like take apart images and spectacles and objects and commodities, and that would be enough to understand them. But of course you've got to, I believe quite strongly, you've got to look at these much more out of focus components of these phenomena and deal with them as abstractions as well. And it's hard to explain, but it's sort of, to a certain extent, it's something I've tried to do in the work. And by doing it, it means that there's always a time problem, that the work I present is often out of time with itself. So the different components of an exhibition or a project don't synchronize in terms of their usefulness over time. But that's because on one hand, I'm dealing with the built world and the semiotics of the built world. On the other hand, I'm trying to address the abstraction of development and the abstraction of, you know, the under-examined results of abstraction, if you see what I mean. The first exhibition I did in 1989 was a series of simple schematic facades for potential buildings, but not in this kind of utopian way, of things that could really be done, like modest, simple buildings and structures that had no unique visionary quality. They had this sense of just being these, I could do these endlessly, this endlessness, and this sense of endlessness that you could keep returning back to this sense of this constant, this desire in a way of mine to try and keep alive the corpse of a certain kind of abstraction, keeps recurring in the work. It keeps coming back, even though I'm deploying it for different reasons. I'm not always doing it for the same reason.
Yeah.
In that first exhibition, it was done because I was interested in the idea of the things that are just alongside art, and I wanted to occupy the role of the person who is not an artist but is just alongside. And later on I used it sometimes to indicate a backdrop or a setting for some ideas to be exchanged, and then later still I would use it to demonstrate a physical form of part of a narrative. And within that, what you see, what I was trying to achieve is something that cannot be resolved. That there are these things that kind of sit in a sort of semi-autonomous way, like they're not completely separate from the world. They can never be truly apart, but they have this kind of parallel relationship with other ideas that I don't try to resolve these two things. This is things keep going side by side. There are these parallel tracks, and this is the key in a way to understand the approach, I think. I've always been interested in this. If you could say there was a gap between the movement of modernity, like the general track, which can of course be devastating and complicated if you're getting up at 5 in the morning to go and work in a factory in China, but it also means a kind of procedure of technological development, the progress of modernity, which can force people into, it's not always positive, it can go in many directions, in relation to the critical potential of modernism as a kind of response to industry and to development and to progress. And I'm really interested in the gap between these two tracks, the critical, self-conscious, abstract ideas behind modernism in relation to the trajectory of modernity. It's in this gap that I find the ideas.